And one of the advantages of being a federal system is you've got 50 different sets of policies, and you can mix and match and try different things. And so all 50 states are not going to double their industrial plant. No.
Just Texas.
Texas is probably going to triple. Northern Mexico is probably going to triple. Here, it's going to be a really squishy figure because so much of the tech sector is also in services, so it's kind of a hard measure. But different states are going to be able to take care of this at different angles. And if you're kind of looking for like the one thing to watch to determine if we can even try this, assuming the green transition stops today, assuming all we do is build out the industrial plant in order to produce our own manufactured goods, we need to increase electricity production in the United States by 50%. And if your community cannot get the extra power, then it's really hard for you to get into manufacturing. So there's going to be a lot of lead time here. I phrased that wrong. There's going to be a lot of leading indicators that tell us who is going to try to grab an outsized chunk of this. When we think of globalization, we're usually thinking of transport and manufacturing, and there's nothing wrong with that, but every sector we have is globalized. And if you look at the original green revolution, lowercase g, the agricultural revolution of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was about bringing industrial inputs to lands that hadn't had them before, places that could not be major agricultural producers without synthetic fertilizers. The biggest beneficiary from that is Brazil. And the biggest provider of those things is Russia. And the biggest processor of these things is China. So it doesn't take any more than a mild case of deglobalization to break global agriculture in its current form. And there's no way you do that without losing 1 billion people. So the countries that are able to have an indigenous supply system for agriculture are largely exempt. The places that were producing food before 1950 because they had good land and good weather are largely exempt. And the US is at the top of the list in both of those. We only import about 10% of our nitrogen fertilizer, only about 10% of our phosphate, and most of that comes from within the hemisphere. We do import 90% of our potash, but almost all of that comes from Canada. So, they are good for something. But those numbers are almost entirely flipped when you're looking at Australia or Brazil. So it's easy to massively increase your electricity production and then double the size of your industrial plant. That's the low-hanging fruit in the change that's coming. Even if you're able to build out the replacement for the fertilizer and the transport system, you've still missed a half a dozen harvests. And that means you've lost a lot of people already. Fun little story. During the first month of the Ukraine war, when Putin was the one making all the nuclear threats personally, the US ambassador was dispatched. And he basically said, I'm going to not tell you anything you don't know here. I'm just going to shine a light on what you do know from a different angle. It's like, you remember back 2 months ago when the day you decided when the war was going to start, what day it was going to be on, you were in that bunker under the Kremlin that was the safe in the safe in the safe. No one was taking notes because you didn't want anything to leak out. There no possibility of electronic eavesdropping. And do you remember how an hour after you left that bunker, we shared the full minutes of that meeting with the media? That was our way of telling you that we know exactly where you are at any moment. So if you think you can fling a nuke into the Western Hemisphere, and the first half dozen that come back are going to go absolutely anywhere but directly up your ass, you're out of your mind. So stop it. And he did. Now it's all his flunkies making the threats. The point is that Russia, despite its flaws, Putin, despite his flaws, he has an inner circle. He has people he trusts. He has people that he discusses things with. And so you can tap his phones. You can hack his emails. You can get an idea of what's going on within the Kremlin. You can't do that in Beijing because Xi speaks with no one. Now, 5 years ago, I knew for certain that the understanding of the Politburo was that a war for Taiwan, even if they could capture the place easily, wasn't going to solve anything for them. In fact, it would be the end of China's industrial experience because China imports 80% of its energy and 80% of the inputs that allow it to grow its own food. So you put 2 destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin and it all shuts down. And you have a post-industrial collapse complete with a famine in under 6 months that within a couple of years probably kills half the population. They knew that. I don't know if they know that anymore. No one's certainly going to remind Xi of it. And so you've got this leader who is imbibing almost nothing but his own propaganda. The official strategic military plan for the PLA now, the People's Liberation Army, is Xi Jinping economic thought. He wrote a treatise on the role of military in society, and they now study that instead of doing proper wargaming. And so I can't tell you that there's going to be a kinder outcome here that's more based on compromise and reality, because Xi has made sure that he's not part of that reality. And that makes it unpredictable, but I don't think there's a lot of hope for kind of a nuanced negotiation here. You guys remember when Blinken went out in the aftermath of the balloon fiasco? He went so he could have a conversation with the foreign minister about how far up the information blackout went, and he found out that the foreign minister hadn't spoken to Xi in 4 months. This isn't a country anymore. This is just a march. There's not an institution, there's a person. And Biden, from a foreign military strategic point of view, I think is kind of a B-rate president, which is the best we've had. Not Trump, not W, not Obama, not Clinton. Yeah, since Herbert Walker Bush. Definitely the best on security issues since Herbert Walker Bush. Admittedly, it's a low bar. And he's clearly losing his mind. Gives you an idea of how low the bar is. One of the beautiful things about having a president that's older than the pyramids is that he remembers the pyramids. He's seen the long run of history, and he's definitely a subscriber to the age-old American doctrine that our system is so stable that all we have to do is outweight them. And that's a correct assessment. Doesn't mean that we can't have better policy on a day-to-day basis. Definitely not saying that. On an economic point of view, oh my God. Yeah, he's definitely in the bottom third. But so were the last 5. So, it's, again, low bar. Politically, what we are going through right now is every generation or two, the factions that make up our parties move around. It's a feature of our electoral laws. And eventually some jump ship, some switch sides. The factions rise and fall in power within the coalitions, and at the end of the process, you get 2 fundamentally new parties. This is the 6th time we've done this, and we are right in the middle of it right now. So the business community and the national security community have been kicked out of the Republican coalition, and the unions have left the Democratic coalition. And so if you're wondering why economic policy in Biden and Trump eras just makes no sense, that's because it makes no sense. Because the people who have been responsible for making economic policy in this country for the last 180 years, for the first time in 180 years, aren't even in the room. They're not allowed in the room. And you've got MAGA who thinks that the business community is part of the problem. And then you've got the Greens on the other side who want to punish the business community. And until such time as the unions or the business community or both end up in one or the other coalitions, this is just where we are. So this is definitely one of those times where, thank God, we're a federal system where the state and the local governments are responsible for most of the